He hands that created miracles in the operating room had a terrifying story that no one could have imagined. What happened next will leave you speechless. Excuse me, miss. The nurse's station is down the hall. The arrogant voice belonged to Dr. Harrison, the hospital's chief resident. He barely glanced up from his clipboard as he addressed the woman in scrubs, standing quietly in the corner of the trauma bay. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, Dr. Sarah Chen continued to study the X-rays on the light board, her dark eyes moving with the precision of someone reading a map of familiar territory. At 34, she appeared unremarkable to the untrained eye. Average height, black hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wearing the same blue scrubs as every other medical professional in the building. But those who looked closer might have noticed something different. The way she carried herself, the absolute stillness in her posture, the small, almost invisible scar that traced along her left temple, disappearing into her hairline. I said, "The nurse's station is that way," Dr. Harrison repeated, his voice growing sharp with impatience. He was addressing what he assumed was a confused nurse who had wandered into his domain. Sarah finally turned, her gaze meeting his. There was no anger in her eyes, no defensiveness, just a calm, measuring look that somehow made the arrogant young doctor shift uncomfortably. "I'm exactly where I need to be," she said quietly. The trauma bay doors burst open. Paramedics rushed in, wheeling a gurney, carrying a man whose chest rose and fell in rapid, shallow gasps. Blood soaked through multiple layers of gauze pressed against his abdomen. "What do we have?" Dr. Harrison called out, immediately shifting into professional mode. "Male, mid-30s, multiple gunshot wounds to the torso," the lead paramedic reported breathlessly. "Lost a lot of blood. Pressure's dropping fast. We've got maybe minutes." Dr. Harrison's confident demeanor cracked slightly as he processed the severity of the case. This wasn't a routine emergency. This was a combat-level trauma, the kind that separated competent doctors from exceptional ones. What happened in the next 30 seconds would become legend in that hospital. Dr. Harrison approached the patient, his hands hovering uncertainly over the wounded man. The complexity of the injuries was immediately apparent. Multiple entry wounds, likely internal bleeding, possible organ damage. His training had prepared him for many things, but not this level of catastrophic trauma. "We need to get him a surgery immediately," he announced, but his voice lacked conviction. "Prep or 3 and call the attending." "The attending is in surgery," a nurse replied urgently. "Won't be available for at least 2 hours." 2 hours. Everyone in the room knew the patient didn't have 2 hours. That's when Sarah stepped forward. "Move aside," she said, her voice cutting through the chaos with surgical precision. Dr. Harrison turned, irritation flashing across his face. "I told you, the nurse's station is dash." He stopped mid-sentence. Sarah had pulled on surgical gloves with movements so fluid and practiced they seemed choreographed. Her entire demeanor had shifted. The quiet woman in scrubs had transformed into something else entirely, a force of absolute authority and competence. "You have a patient with multiple GSWs, likely hitting the liver and possibly the inferior vena cava," she said, not to Dr. Harrison, but to the room. "Pressure's dropping because he's bleeding out internally. You've got maybe 6 minutes before he goes into irreversible shock." Her hands moved to the patient's chest, palpating with the confidence of someone who had done this countless times under far worse conditions. Dr. Harrison stammered, "You can't just. I need a thoracotomy tray for units of ONEG, and someone to push AP now," Sarah continued, completely ignoring the resident. Her voice carried the unmistakable tone of command. "And someone call security to get this man out of my trauma bay." The nurses looked at each other uncertainly. They didn't know who this woman was, but they could see what Dr. Harrison apparently couldn't. She knew exactly what she was doing. What followed was a masterclass in trauma surgery performed by someone who supposedly didn't exist in the hospital's records. Sarah's hands moved with a precision that defied explanation. While Dr. Harrison continued to sputter protests, She made the initial incision with a confidence that spoke of hundreds of similar procedures. Blood immediately welled up, but she was ready for it, her movements economic and sure. "Suction," she called out, and a nurse automatically complied. Within minutes, she had exposed the source of the bleeding, a severed branch of the hepatic artery that was pouring the patient's life onto the operating table. It was exactly the kind of injury that required not just medical knowledge, but the kind of experience that came from working in places where hesitation meant death. Dr. Harrison finally found his voice. "Stop. I don't know who you think you are, but you can't just take over my trauma bay." "Security." Sarah's hands never paused. "Your patient is dying because you're more concerned with protocol than with saving his life," she said without looking up. "Are you going to help, or are you going to keep getting in my way?" The patient's vital signs, which had been plummeting, began to stabilize as she worked. The confidence in her movements, the precision of each stitch, the way she seemed to anticipate each complication before it arose, it was unlike anything the hospital staff had ever witnessed. A security guard appeared at the door, summoned by Dr. Harrison's earlier call. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to step away from the patient." That's when something remarkable happened. The head nurse, a woman named Janet who had worked in trauma for over 20 years, stepped between the security guard and the operating table. "Officer," she said firmly, "I don't know who she is, but she's saving that man's life. Dr. Harrison couldn't handle this case, and she can. So unless you want to explain to a widow why you stopped the one person who could save her husband, I suggest you wait." As Sarah worked, something was happening in the administrative offices 3 floors above. Dr. Harrison's call to security had triggered a chain reaction that was about to expose a truth no one in the hospital was prepared for. The security chief, a former military man named Rodriguez, had run the mystery surgeon's description through the hospital's database. When that came up empty, he expanded his search. What he found made him reach immediately for his secure phone line. The call went to a number that very few people had access to, the direct line to the Department of Defense Liaison for Medical Personnel. "This is Rodriguez at City General," he said, his voice tense. "I need you to run a check on someone. Female, mid-30s, Asian American, approximately 5'6". She just performed what looks like battlefield surgery in our trauma bay, and she's not in any of our systems." The response came back within minutes, and it changed everything. "Rodriguez, you need to listen very carefully," the voice on the other end said. "The woman you're describing, is she wearing any identifying marks? Scars, tattoos, anything distinctive?" Rodriguez looked through the observation window at the ongoing surgery. "Small scar on her left temple. Moves like military." There was a pause that seemed to stretch forever. "That's Dr. Sarah Chen. Major Sarah Chen. She's supposed to be dead." Back in the trauma bay, Sarah had successfully repaired the damaged artery and was working on closing the patient's abdomen. Her movements remained steady, professional, but something had changed in the atmosphere of the room. Word was spreading through the hospital's informal communication network, the network that existed among nurses, orderlies, and support staff who noticed things that doctors often missed. The patient was stable. Against all odds, the man who had been minutes from death was now breathing regularly, his vital signs improving by the minute. Dr. Harrison, who had been remarkably quiet during the actual surgery, cleared his throat. "Well, that was impressive, but I still need to see your credentials." "Hospital policy." Sarah didn't look up from her suturing. "Dr. Harrison, in the past hour, you've shown more concern for paperwork than for human life. I suggest you focus on post-operative care for your patient." "My patient?" Harrison's voice rose. "You can't just waltz in here and take over Dash." He was interrupted by the sound of multiple footsteps in the hallway. Through the glass doors of the trauma bay, they could see a group of people approaching. Not medical staff, but men in dark suits who moved with the purposeful stride of federal agents. Sarah's hand stilled for just a moment. It was the first sign of uncertainty she had shown since entering the trauma bay. "Dr. Chen," the lead agent stood in the doorway, his voice respectful but firm. "Ma'am, we need to talk." The trauma bay fell completely silent. Even the background hum of medical equipment seemed to fade away. Dr. Harrison's face went pale. "Dr. Chen?" "But," You said you were a nurse. Sarah finally looked up from her patient. I never said I was a nurse. You assumed. What came next will be talked about in that hospital for years to come. Agent Martinez, the lead federal investigator, stepped into the trauma bay. His presence immediately commanded attention, not through intimidation, but through the kind of quiet authority that spoke of serious credentials and even more serious responsibilities. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced to the assembled medical staff, you've just witnessed surgery performed by one of the most decorated combat surgeons in U.S. military history. Dr. Harrison's jaw dropped. Combat surgeon? Agent Martinez nodded grimly. Dr. Sarah Chen served 3 tours in Afghanistan and 2 in Iraq. She was the chief trauma surgeon at Forward Operating Base Chapman, where she performed over 800 combat surgeries under enemy fire. She holds the Distinguished Service Cross, 2 Bronze Stars, and a Purple Heart. Sarah had returned to her suturing, but her shoulders tensed slightly at the recitation of her record. She also, Agent Martinez continued, his voice dropping lower, was declared killed in action 14 months ago when her medical convoy was hit by an IED outside Kandahar. The silence in the trauma bay was deafening. Janet, the head nurse who had defended Sarah earlier, found her voice first. Killed in action? But she's right here. That's what we need to discuss, Agent Martinez said, his eyes fixed on Sarah. Dr. Chen, you've been listed as Kia for over a year. Your family held a funeral. There's a grave with your name on it at Arlington. Sarah tied off the final suture and stepped back from the patient. For the first time since she had entered the trauma bay, her composure cracked slightly. My convoy was hit, she said quietly. I was thrown clear. But my team, her voice faltered. My entire surgical team was killed. 7 people who were under my command. The truth, when it finally came out, was more complex and heartbreaking than anyone could have imagined. Sarah had indeed been in that convoy when it was attacked. The explosion had thrown her nearly 50 feet from the road, leaving her with a traumatic brain injury and no memory of who she was. Afghan civilians had found her and taken her to a small village, where she spent months recovering under the care of a local doctor who had studied medicine in Pakistan. I couldn't remember my name, my rank, or where I was from, Sarah explained, her voice steady but haunted. But somehow, my hands remembered how to save lives. When wounded, people were brought to the village. I could treat them. I knew procedures I couldn't remember learning. Agent Martinez nodded. We've been tracking reports of an American woman providing medical care in remote Afghan villages. The locals called you the ghost doctor because you appeared and disappeared without warning, always showing up where the wounded were most desperate. Dr. Harrison, who had been listening in stunned silence, finally spoke. But why didn't you contact the military? Why didn't you try to come home? Sarah's expression darkened. Because I remembered enough to know that my team died because of faulty intelligence. Someone in the chain of command knew that convoy route was compromised. My people died because someone made a decision that their lives were expendable. The implications of her words hit the room like a physical blow. You went underground because you didn't know who to trust, Agent Martinez said, his voice grim with understanding. I spent a year trying to piece together what happened, Sarah continued. Moving from village to village, treating whoever needed help, and slowly uncovering the truth about why we were sent into that ambush. What Sarah had discovered during her year in hiding would eventually expose a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of military command. There was a supply contract worth $40 million, she explained to the group. Medical supplies and surgical equipment for forward operating bases. But the supplies were substandard, fake medications, surgical instruments that broke during operations, blood that wasn't properly screened. Agent Martinez's expression was grim. People were dying because of defective medical supplies. My team was getting close to exposing it, Sarah said. We had documented dozens of cases where soldiers died because of equipment failures. We were supposed to testify before a congressional committee the week after our convoy was hit. The trauma bay felt, charged with tension. Everyone present was beginning to understand that they weren't just witnessing the return of a presumed dead soldier. They were at the center of a story that could bring down powerful people. So, when you survived the attack, Janet began. I became a liability, Sarah finished. Someone who was supposed to be dead, but who might still remember what we had discovered. Dr. Harrison looked confused. But why surface now? Why risk eposing yourself? Sarah looked down at the patient she had just saved, a man who was alive because she had refused to remain hidden when she was needed. Because this is what I am, she said simply. This is what I was trained to do. I took an oath to save lives, not to hide from people who would rather protect their profits than their soldiers. As Sarah spoke, Agent Martinez received a message on his secure phone. His expression grew even more serious as he read it. Dr. Chen, he said urgently, we have a problem. The people behind that supply contract know you're here. They've known you were alive, and they've been tracking you. Before anyone could ask what that meant, the hospital's emergency lighting flickered on. The main power had been cut. Through the windows, they could see vehicles surrounding the hospital. Not police cars or federal agents, but unmarked SUVs with tinted windows. Janet, Sarah said, her voice snapping back to the command tone she had used during the surgery. How many other patients are in the trauma bay? 3 in recovery, 1 in surgery, Janet replied, immediately understanding the implications. We need to evacuate them. Now. But Agent Martinez shook his head. There's no time. They're not here to arrest you, Dr. Chen. They're here to make sure you never testify about what you know. Sarah's hands clenched into fists. After everything she had survived, after a year of hiding and healing, it was coming down to this moment. Then they picked the wrong hospital, she said grimly. What happened next transformed City General Hospital into something resembling the combat zones Sarah knew so well. The elevators had been disabled, but Sarah knew hospitals like she knew anatomy. Every back stairwell, every service corridor, every route that could be used for emergency evacuation. She had seen too many medical facilities come under attack overseas to be unprepared for this moment. Martinez, she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had commanded under fire. How many agents do you have? 2 more in the building, for outside, he replied, checking his weapon. Not enough. Sarah turned to Janet. I need you to get on the hospital's PA system and announce a code silver. Lock down all floors except this one. Dr. Harrison looked bewildered. Code silver? That's for armed intruders. This is a hospital, not a war zone. Dr. Harrison, Sarah said, her voice cutting through his panic. In about 5 minutes, this hospital is going to become exactly what I spent 5 years working in, a place where people with guns decide who lives and who dies. The only difference is, this time I'm not going to let them win. Through the trauma bay windows, they could see figures moving through the hospital corridors, men in tactical gear who were clearly not there for medical reasons. Sarah moved to the supply cabinet and began pulling out items that most people would see as medical supplies, but which someone with her background recognized as potential weapons and tools. There's something you need to understand, she told the assembled group. These people killed my entire team to protect their secret. They won't hesitate to kill everyone in this hospital to get to me. The first shots weren't fired in the trauma bay, but in the hospital's main corridor. Sarah heard the distinctive crack of assault rifles, a sound that brought back memories of Afghanistan that she had tried to bury. They're not trying to arrest me, she said grimly. They're here to eliminate witnesses. Agent Martinez was coordinating with his team over his radio, but the news wasn't good. The hospital was surrounded, and the attackers were moving through the building systematically. We need to get you out of here, Martinez told Sarah. She shook her head. There are patients on every floor of this hospital. People in surgery, in recovery, in intensive care. I'm not leaving them. Dr. Chen, you can't save everyone. Sarah turned to face him, and for a moment, everyone in the room saw not a hospital surgeon, but a combat veteran who had made impossible decisions under the worst possible circumstances. Agent Martinez, I've spent the last year asking myself why I survived when my team didn't. Why I lived when 7 better people than me died in that convoy. Her voice was steady, but there was a fire in her eyes. Maybe this is why. Maybe I survived so I could be here right now to make sure these people don't succeed. The sound of gunfire was getting closer. Sarah began giving orders with the same calm precision she had shown during the surgery. Janet, I need you to coordinate patient evacuation from the upper floors. Use the service elevators. They're on a separate power grid. Dr. Harrison, you're going to assist Agent Martinez in securing this floor. I'm not trained for combat. Harrison protested. Neither were the Afghan villagers who protected me for 6 months, Sarah replied. But they did it anyway because it was right. What followed was unlike anything in the hospital's history. Sarah moved through the building with the tactical awareness of someone who had navigated far more dangerous places, coordinating the evacuation of patients while staying one step ahead of the armed men hunting her. The conspiracy she had uncovered wasn't just about medical supplies. It was about a systematic pattern of fraud that had cost dozens of American lives. The people responsible had billions of dollars at stake, and they were willing to do anything to protect their secret. But they had made one crucial mistake. They had underestimated what happens when a combat surgeon decides that some things are worth fighting for. In the hospital's main corridor, Sarah encountered the leader of the assault team. He was a man in expensive tactical gear, carrying military-grade weapons, but lacking the bearing of someone who had ever actually served. Dr. Sarah Chen, he said, his voice eerily calm. You should have stayed dead. I tried, Sarah replied, her hands steady despite the circumstances. But then I remembered something. I took an oath. First, do no harm. But sometimes stopping the people who cause harm requires a different kind of intervention. The confrontation that followed would be investigated by multiple federal agencies. But the outcome was never in doubt. Sarah had survived a year in hostile territory, had performed surgery under fire, had rebuilt her life from nothing. A corporate assassin was no match for someone who had already faced death and chosen life. 3 months later, Dr. Sarah Chen stood before a congressional committee, no longer the woman in hiding she had been. The testimony she gave, based on the evidence she and her team had gathered before their convoy was attacked, led to the largest military contractor fraud case in U.S. history. 17 high-ranking officials were indicted. The medical supply contracts were canceled and rebid. New protocols were put in place to protect whistleblowers in the military medical system. But perhaps more importantly, the 7 members of Sarah's surgical team were finally honored properly. Their families learned that they had died not in a random attack, but while serving their country's highest ideals, protecting the lives of fellow soldiers. Sarah returned to work as a trauma surgeon, but not in a military hospital. She chose City General, the place where she had first emerged from hiding. Dr. Harrison, humbled by what he had witnessed,